This session will be run from 10 a.m. to noon, and please note again that we are recording this webinar. Thank you. So, my name is Elizabeth O'Farrell, and I work here at NSAI, and I'm the project manager responsible for the Technical Committee NSAI TC23, which is the Universal Design Standards Consultative Committee. The role of NSAI is to facilitate stakeholders to participate in the development of standards at national, European, and international level. And we are governed at European level by the Regulation 1025 of 2012 on standardization. And you will also see on the slide that NSAI was established under the Act of 1996. And here are the links that can be checked later on. Thank you. So the agenda for this morning's webinar. We've had the welcome and introductions, and then we will have an overview of universal design and standards by Gerard Craddock. Then Tom Gray will talk about the background and the key existing built environment standards. Why develop a standard for universal design dwellings will be given by Ruth O'Reilly. And then we'll have a 10-minute comfort break. After the comfort break, Tom Gray will talk about standards development process and the timelines. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session and close the webinar with Ruth O'Reilly. So our speakers this morning, we have Gerard Craddock, who is the chair of NSAI TC23, Universal Design Standards Consultative Committee. Tom Gray, who is the chair of the Subcommittee 1 on Accessibility of the Built Environment, will join us, along with Ruth O'Reilly, who has been appointed the chair of the Working Group 6 on UD dwellings, will also speak this morning.
Very good. Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Gerard Craddock here. And thank you for attending here this morning on a gorgeous April spring morning. So just to give the background, I head up the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design as part of the National Disability Authority. We're unique and we're the only statutory centre for universal design in the world, set up in 2007. The areas that we cover is looking at the physical, digital environments, but also looking at services and systems. Services and design of services has become very prominent in the last number of years, particularly working with various government departments, etc. But I suppose the key area that I'll mention briefly is looking at the whole area of a system, which is what we're talking about here today. Just to give what the definition of universal design is, it is in the Disability Act of 2007. So universal design is the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, I'm just looking for the next one here, age, size, ability and disability. So the key words that we're talking about, and particularly in relation to the standard we're discussing this morning, is can you access a dwelling? Can you understand, particularly if you're talking about apartments? And then can you actually use that building, dwelling, house, etc.? So as I mentioned, a lot of our work we base around a system, looking at a system. So, for example, in the area of built environment, we have national policy, which Ruth O'Reilly will talk about later. We have legislation as well under minimum that may be under Part M. And what we're talking about here this morning is developing a national standard around universal design dwellings. But also then what we look at an organizational level called the meso level that you can actually monitor and certify, be it a building or be it technology, etc. Codes of practice, which we're heavily involved in developing as part of our remit, as part of our standards and monitoring unit within the National Disability Authority, but also then the resources and toolkits, the how do you actually apply this at the coal face? And we've been very successful in developing a number of toolkits, be it in the ICT, but also looking at the whole area of communications over the last number of years. And finally, then the whole area of training, support, awareness raising, being very much part of that. So looking at from a systems perspective, how will this standard, one, link with legislation and policy, but also then on the ground, how can this actually be implemented going forward once this standard has been developed? So under the National Standards Authority Technical Committee number 23, which I chair, called the Universal Design Standards Consultative Committee, another big title. And underneath that, there are 6 subcommittees, and the one that were highlighted on the screen here this morning is the whole area of accessibility in the built environment, chaired by Tom Gray, who you will hear next. But also we're covering areas mobility in wheelchairs, assistive technology, the whole area of ICT that I've mentioned, product services and the range of users, and also a significant one that we've done quite a bit of work on in the last couple of years with NSAI is aging societies. And then underneath this subcommittee 01, which Tom Gray chairs, there are 5 or 6 working groups, which on the next slide, we have Tom Gray, who chairs the subcommittee 01, and underneath that we have the working group 6, which specifically set up for this new standard on universal design dwellings, chaired by Ruth O'Reilly, who is part of the Centre for Excellence team as the Senior Built Environment Design Advisor. On that note, just to again highlight, not only do we work at standards level, at national level, but also at European. The European standards bodies are called CEN, CENELEC and ETSI. And an important point to note here, that a new piece of legislation coming from Europe called the European Accessibility Act, which is about to be transposed into legislation in Ireland this summer. There are a whole series of standards to be revised or developed as part of that work. Tom will actually mention briefly one of the key standards in the whole area of built environment, but also working at international level, but the International Standards Organization, but also work with the International Telecommunications Union, particularly in the whole area of ICT and accessibility. And then I hand over to Tom Gray. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant, Chair. Thank you very much. Okay, so some of the committees Chair mentioned there a minute ago, one of our key pieces of work that we've been involved with for the last couple of years, it was published the year before last at this stage, is an important document called 17210. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Excellent. So this is a European standard, but it's been transposed or adopted in Ireland. So it's now ISEN 17210 2021. So a lot of my co-panelists here were involved in that, as were quite a few people, I think, that are attending here today. I see a couple of names that were heavily involved in this document. So this document covers accessibility and usability of the built environment. And I'll move on to the next slide. Yeah, and there's essentially 3 parts to this. The first bit I've just mentioned. It's accessibility and usability of the built environment functional requirements. And this is a main document, and this sets out common minimum functional requirements and recommendations to achieve an accessible and universal, accessible and usable built environment underpinned by Design for All, or universal design approach. And then this is accompanied by 2 other documents. The first one here being technical performance criteria and specifications. And I'll run through this in a couple of minutes again in a bit more detail, but this sets out values and so on to actually achieve their requirements and recommendations in the first section, in the first document. And then the third document, I suppose, in this trio is 17622. And then this is criteria to assess conformity of the built environment with the functional requirements and recommendations as set out in the first. So it's a three-part document that's really important, I think, to this piece of work we're talking about this morning. And you'll see, I suppose, that it acts as, it's an important companion piece to the new UD standard that we're developing. But it also covers a wider spatial scales in terms of the built environment, where it looks at the public realm, it looks at street design, it looks at various settings such as transport, accommodation, education, health, various things, and I suppose within that, the new standard that we're talking about will fit quite well. So we'll discuss that in a minute. So I'll move on to the next slide. So 17210 and the companion documents are important for a range of stakeholders, and they've already been taken up and used quite extensively. But a key focus and a big part of the preparation of these documents at a European level was in the context of public and private procurement. And when we look at the importance of procurement in European context, and obviously in Ireland also, we see that there's 250,000 public authorities in the EU spending 14% of GDP. So that's nearly 2 trillion euros a year on the purchase of services, works, and supplies, including the built environment and so on. So you can see, having a European-wide document as a kind of a go-to standard is really critical to inform procurement. And in many sectors such as energy, transport, waste management, social protection, and so on, public authorities are also some of the principal buyers here. So the public sector can use procurement as a kind of as a lever in many ways to boost jobs, growth and investment, and to create an economy that is more innovative, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. But also, of course, by taking on board accessibility and usability of the built environment through a universal design approach, really critical. So I might move on to the next slide. So just to give you a sense of the first document, 17210, this describes the basic minimum functional requirements and recommendations for an accessible and usable built environment, as I said, following a Design for All or a universal design approach. And it's about facilitating equitable and safe use for a wide range of users, including persons with disabilities. The requirements and recommendations given in this document are applicable across the full spectrum of the built environment. And these functional accessibility and usability requirements and recommendations are relevant to the design, construction, refurbishment, or adaptation and maintenance of all built environments, including outdoor, pedestrian, and urban areas. So, and you'll see in a minute, it covers a huge range completely across the spatial scale of the built environment as mentioned. Next slide. So we see that in this document, you have all the standard stuff you get in standards scope, which you've just gone through, the references to terms and conditions. But it starts to provide some really useful information, such as section 5, the diversity of users and design considerations. And this gives a great sets out, as it says there, what you need to consider in terms of people's biological, psychological, and social requirements and needs. So that's a very useful piece, and it underpins the rest of the document. And then we get into such things as wayfinding, and that was placed up there because wayfinding is applicable across all parts of the built environment, and it's important to get that right up front. Then we have accessibility in the outdoor environment. We have arrival and departure areas such as parking and so on. We have horizontal circulation in buildings, vertical circulation. We start to get into specific indoor and outdoor areas, equipment and provisions, sanitary accommodations. And again, another important section there, 14, fire safety for all, which is really critical because oftentimes there can be a conflict between accessibility and usability and designing for fire safety. So that's a really important piece there. And that deals with evacuation and emergency exits and so on. It gets into environmental conditions in buildings. And you'll see that it deals with a number of types of settings, cultural and leisure, administrative, outdoor areas, transport facilities, and so on. But it does deal with accommodation now, and that's, I suppose, where the standard that we're developing in many ways plugs in. Next slide. So when you see the accommodation section, and then this starts to, I suppose, also give a rationale for why we would develop a new standard in this space while there's a very substantial and detailed standard in existence already and very recent, dealing with the accessibility and usability of the built environment. However, the accommodation section has a subsection called adaptable housing. Now, that adaptable housing, it deals with and is called, housing across the spectrum. They refer to terms such as lifetime and so on. So it does refer to general housing requirements and so on, but it's dealt with in a really high level way. It's really only 5 pages over the entire document, and this is a 350-page document or something. So it's very high level. It deals with stairs and internally, that is, it deals with stairs and dwellings. It deals with internal doors. It deals with internal layout. It deals with toilets and bathrooms, kitchens, and then outdoor and living space, including gardens and balconies, but all in a very high level way. In fact, that's the diagram, the figure you see there is quite good in what it illustrates in terms of access and moving to these key spaces within an accommodation. But that's the kind of detail we're talking about. I'll move on to the next slide. So I'm going to hand over to Ruth in a moment, but this gives you a sense that while the document 17210 and its accompanying 2 standards is a fantastic piece of work and provides great detail across huge aspects of the built environment, in terms of dwelling and dwelling design, it is quite small and quite limited, therefore opening up the requirement in many ways and an opportunity to develop this standard. So on that, I'll hand over to Ruth.
Thanks very much, Tom. So I'm just going to try and set the context today. So the reason why we're starting out in this important piece of work to develop a standard for universal design dwellings. So if I could have the next slide. I suppose setting it in an international and maybe a global context, first of all, is around sustainability. And we know that leave no one behind is a key promise of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And on screen then is number 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals, Sustainable Cities and Communities, which says we should make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And of course, housing is a key element of all cities and human settlements. So the next slide, please. And then just to look at the context in Ireland and some statistics from our census in 2016. We're still waiting for the equivalent data from the most recent census. So I suppose a critical statistic in relation to housing from that census was that 27.5%, so that's 1 in 4 households in Ireland have at least one person with a disability living in them. So I think that in itself is an important statistic, but it's also to be aware that that's just a point in time statistic. And we have research from the States that says that there's a 60% probability that any new house will be occupied with a person with some sort of a functional impairment over the lifespan of the house, because we know that people's needs change over time. Our aging population is also an important piece of context in relation to the work to develop the standards, because we know that the percentage of older people in our population is increasing. So it'll rise from 15% in 2020 to reach 18% in 2030, and then is forecast to reach 27% by 2050. And the graph I have on screen is showing the link, the very clear link between aging and disability. You can see on the x-axis there we have aging, and on the y-axis the prevalence of disability. So as we age in the population, the prevalence of disability increases. So 23% of people in the 65 to 69 age range have a disability. This increases to 50% for the 80 to 84 age range, and 70% for those age 85 plus. So I suppose for any designers here, this really is about designing for your future self. And I think all of these statistics are extremely relevant to the housing that we're building now, because we need to be taking a long-term view on designing for our population. The next slide, please. So this is a graph or a graphic that I've taken from the Age Friendly Ireland website, and it's an image of the housing continuum. So it looks at different types of housing. So in the orange and on the left is living in mainstream housing in the community. Just to the right then is moving to supported housing, and then on the extreme right, looking at long-term residential care like nursing homes. So the focus of this work on the standard is looking at how we can extend the range of users of mainstream housing in the community. We know that research shows that the majority of people want to remain in their own home as they age. However, this desire is often challenged by their home not being suitable as their needs change. So essentially, people find a mismatch between their needs and preferences and the design of their home. So we hope that this standard will drive an approach where we move from where we're building homes and then spending a lot of money to adapt them, to incorporating universal design features from the very outset, so that the buildings will be accessible, but also allow for easy adaptation that's cost effective. So the next slide, please. So I just wanted to then talk a little bit about legislation and policy. Starting off with Part M of the building regulations, which set out minimum requirements. So the main regulation is that adequate provision shall be made for people to access and use a building, its facilities and its environs. But we know then that technical guidance document M sets out what's prima facie evidence of compliance with the regulations. And I suppose an important point in relation to housing is that it distinguishes between what's adequate in relation to buildings other than dwellings and dwellings. So it says that the requirements of Part M aim to ensure that regardless of age, size or disability, new buildings other than dwellings are accessible and usable. New dwellings are visitable. So this proposed new standard then will be looking at how we need to design dwellings so that they are accessible and usable, moving on from the visitable standard. Now, of course, it's very important to emphasize, we all know that building regulations are minimum requirements. There's nothing to stop us going beyond minimum requirements, and indeed the technical guidance document itself says that designers should have regard to the philosophy of universal design and make additional provisions where practical and appropriate. So the standard obviously then will be going beyond the minimum in Part M. And the next slide, please. And we do have some important policy in Ireland then we see that the standard will be supporting. So the housing options for our ageing population policy statement, action 4.6, which is on screen there, sets out a very clear target. It says, in partnership with industry, introduce measures to ensure that over a 5-year period, delivery is increased to ensure that 30% of all new dwellings are built to incorporate universal design principles to accommodate our ageing population. Action 4.4 is also an important action in that policy statement. It says, ensure that 50% of apartments in any development that are required to be in excess of minimum sizes are suitable for older people and mobility impaired people, and to develop a template layout for same. And anyone who's familiar with the new Dublin City development plan will see that there's an objective in that now that's related to that action in relation to the design of apartments. And the next slide, please. Another key policy document is the National Housing Strategy for Disabled People. And on screen, I have highlighted a statement from theme 1, which is about accessible housing in communities. So it says an outcome should be that there's an increase in the provision of accessible housing for disabled people by the setting of local needs-related targets for all social housing providers using a universal design approach as appropriate. And I suppose when talking about policy in relation to housing for disabled people, also wanted to mention the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which recognises the rights of persons with disabilities to choose their place of residence, the right of persons with disabilities to adequate housing, and critically to live in the community with choices equal to others. The next slide, please. So again, I have to thank Age Friendly Ireland for the content on this slide, and it is just a selection of new local authority development plans where there are now targets in place in relation to accessible housing, sometimes referred to as age-friendly housing, universal design housing, housing for people with disabilities. So you can see there's quite a range in this. In Carlow, it's 5% where minimum, where there's in excess of 20 units. Dublin City applies to apartments, 25% of apartments in excess of 10. The draft Donegal development plan says there should be 30% in excess of 7 units, and where there's less than 7, at least 1. The Fingal draft development plan, interestingly, distinguishes between private and social housing. So it looks for 10% in excess of 100 units and 30% in social housing. Meath is 5% in excess of 20. Roscommon, minimum 10% in excess of 10. Westmeath is the same as Meath. And then Wexford is 20% of residential schemes in excess of 5. So, we really welcome these developments in the development plans, and we hope that the standard will also be supporting these targets when it's developed. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about documents that we'll be using as a starting point for developing the standards. You may be aware that in 2015, the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design published Universal Design Guidelines for Homes in Ireland, and we'll be using that as the baseline document to develop the standard. And the next slide. There's also a range of additional resources and sources that we'll be using to inform the standard. So the NDA has also published dementia-friendly dwellings, or guidelines for dementia-friendly dwellings for people with dementia, their families and carers. The IWA best practice access guidelines for designing accessible environments as content on, in particular, wheelchair accessible homes. The Association of Occupational Therapists of Ireland have since published housing design guidelines for occupational therapists, and there's a range of other European and international standards and guidelines that will be used as resources when we're developing the standard. So that's really setting the context for you, I hope. Just, I suppose, to say, why we think this work is very important. And I want to move on now and just talk to you about the title and the scope of the new standard. So the title, it's quite short and snappy: Universal Design Dwellings Requirements and Recommendations. And I suppose critically, the standard will distinguish between what's a requirement, what's a shall in the standard, and what's a recommendation, what's a should in the standard. And if I could have the next slide, yeah. So the scope defines what the standard will include and also informs the reader what's excluded from the standard. And we've drafted a scope, and I thought it would just be useful to read that out from start to finish. If I could have the next slide, just to tell you, what the scope is, the scope of the work. Because when I go back to Tom, we will be, calling for participation in developing this. So this document specifies requirements and recommendations for new dwellings through a universal design approach. Dwellings that can be accessed, understood, and used by all people to the greatest extent possible, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. This document specifies requirements and recommendations for the design of accessible, usable, flexible, and adaptable universal design dwellings, ranging from apartments to individual houses. And the next slide, please. It includes external access routes to dwellings, parking, communal areas, entrances and circulation areas within dwellings, key rooms and facilities within dwellings, and private open spaces. This document provides requirements and recommendations for 2 categories of universal design dwellings. And the next slide, please. This document can be used for assessing the design of existing dwellings and to inform retrofit and refurbishments. So again, at the start, it says that it's for new dwellings, but we're also saying that it can be used for assessing the design of existing dwellings and to inform retrofit and refurbishment. And this document can be used for purpose-built dwellings or residential facilities for older or disabled people, but does not include requirements for assistance, health, and social care facilities that may be required in these settings. So again, the focus is on mainstream housing in the community. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And we are going to take a short break now, I think back in 10 minutes, which would bring us back at 10 to 11. So I think if we leave it there, and we'll be back then with more detail on the process to develop the standards.
Hello all. So we're going to get going again now in the next minute or so. So welcome back. I hope the first session was informative. I know we covered a fair bit of material. And just to remind you that we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions in mind, you can ask them then. However, you can also put them in the Q&A in the chat. That's great because we're monitoring it, and we can read out those questions directly. So sometimes it's easier just to put your question directly in there. But if not, we'll have a bit of a chance to chat at the end. So I'm going to talk you through kind of the process and timelines now for this standard. But bearing in mind what we've covered so far, Ger gave us a good outline of the committees, the various committees that cover this area, accessibility and usability of the built environment through the NSAI. And part of that work I spoke about in terms of developing 17210. So, to be honest, quite a valuable thing to be involved with. It's such a great opportunity to be involved in a group working together, developing this committee. We've time, support, and resources to do it, and it's an important piece of work. So the 17210, the European standard, is an example, I guess, of what has been done. Ruth then talked us through the new standard that's being developed, gave us a scope, gave us an outline, gave us a rationale, and gave us justification. So I think we're all on the same page in terms of the importance, relevance, timeliness, and the real need for this at this point, given what's been called out in various national documents, development plans, and so on. So let's have a quick run through this, right? First of all, with any standard, but particularly this standard, who are the intended users, right? The intended users of any standard, very broad and very wide. Now, this is to be quite a technical standard, to be fair. So it is aimed at government departments and agencies. It is aimed at local authorities. It is aimed at those involved in both public and private procurement, again, for the reasons that I discussed when I was talking about 17210. It's, of course, aimed at built environment design professionals such as architects, planners, engineers, interior designers, and a range of other design professionals such as quantity surveyors and so on that are involved in any kind of a building project. Then, of course, builders and developers themselves, be really critically important for them to understand, to use to develop briefs and so on. Access consultants, people working directly with accessibility in buildings, a very important document for them, and of course many others. And these are just examples. So don't feel left out if we haven't mentioned your profession or so on in that list, because you know these standards are very important documents, and they are aimed at a wide range. Just to point out, they are written, you know, in a technical way. However, this is still very useful for many advocates and consumers and so on. So next slide. So we're really calling on people, you guys now attending here today have taken the time to attend this, take the time out of your day, so you're clearly interested. So we're calling out for people to be involved, to get involved, have your say, use your voice, bring your expertise to bear. So anybody that is interested in participating in this piece of work, you'll see the link there in front of you. That will take you to a part of the NSAI standards development where you get to register and so on. We'll talk about that in a moment. Bearing in mind that the process that's used by the NSAI and all the various committees to develop standards is through consensus. And I've been involved in quite a few, and I can support that. People's voices are listened to, opinions are listened to, and a balance is really struck. So it is about consensus and bringing people on board and being at the table, representing various views, representing various organizations, representing various needs in the built environment. This is your opportunity. Next slide. So there's two kind of main ways, in many ways, that that people can get involved in the development of this standard. First of all, is through the NSAI National Committee, the one we've been discussing that Ruth will be chairing as Working Group 6. This will involve attendance at meetings, participation in discussions, reviewing the draft and submitting comments on the draft itself. Next slide. Then there's a consultation phase, or a public consultation phase. And that follows the work done by the committee that we've just covered in section, or in that previous slide. So we're really encouraging you to join in the work in that previous slide as part of the committee. But people also get the chance then to feed in and comment and have their input when a draft standard is prepared and then published for public consultation. So this is open to people outside of the committee, the working group we've just talked about. And for this project and for this standard, given that its importance, we'll be going the extra mile in many ways. There'll be consultation workshops that we will be holding with various groups. And then there'll be a commenting phase. And that's facilitated through the NSAI open platform called Your Standards, Your Say. And again, you'll see a link to that. So two phases, giving lots of different people the opportunity to get involved. So regardless of whether you've a bit more time to commit to the committee stage, involved in crafting and refining the actual document, or whether you want to get involved in the consultation phase, which is obviously less commitment, but equally very important. Next slide. So the timelines for the development of this standard are as follows. We're having a kickoff meeting in May, and this will be the start kind of official start of the working group 6. And that's when we have people who have registered, hopefully from after today's seminar, bring them together as a committee. And then as we move along from May to September, so May to September 2023, we will develop the draft content. So that's the kind of base document that will be written based on the key documents that Ruth talked about earlier on, using the Universal Design Home Dwellings Homes guidelines as a starting point, or as a basic document, but drawing in all of the other very important documents that have been published before that and since. Then in October there will be a finalization of text and preparation of the draft to send out for a public inquiry. That's the second phase of consultation phase a moment ago. And then when we move into November and then into the following year, January 2024, that's when it goes out for public inquiry and consultation. And that's that period there that in phase 2, that everybody outside the committee gets an opportunity to have their say and feed in. January 2024, that will be the end of the public consultation period. And then from February until April 2024, back at the committee stage, is where we will review the comments that were submitted and update the draft, taking on board and developing through consensus, as we said earlier on. And then in May through to July 2024, we have the finalization of the content of the standard. That's where we take on board all of the comments. We start kind of, filling out or adding any information that's missing. And then in July through to October 2024, it's an editing, it's a kind of refining stage, and it's when it goes to the NSAI for final approval. And then, please God, in January 2025, we'll have publication of the document. So that's the process. It's in some ways it takes a bit of time, but a document like this that deals with such important issues and that we develop by consensus, we need to take that participatory approach, and we need to give it time. And you'll see that though this timeline in front of you is certainly giving the time, space, and opportunity for everybody to have their say. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So next steps. The next steps for you guys, hopefully, is to register your interest. We showed this link earlier on. So it's there. Get involved in standards development. You go in there and it'll ask you for some details, and then you'll get registered. And then we're having a kickoff meeting on the 2nd of May. It's not that far away, but still gives you plenty of time to register and get involved. And then that's when the work commences on developing the content. You'll be very well supported. I know there's people on this call that have been, like myself, been involved in the preparation of previous drafts. And hopefully they'll be involved and they'll have lots of experience. But for others who maybe it's their first time, you will be very well supported in terms of participation. NSAI, the committee themselves, and through the chair, Ruth will provide as much support as required. So between meetings, the committee members will meet and we review the draft and the submitted comments and so on, and take them on board. And then during meetings, when we're meeting, it'll be a combination of online and in person. We will review the comments together and agree on the revised text. And at that point, we will make our own observations and notes and so on. So that consensus, kind of constant building of this document it continues throughout. So that's a bit of a run through of the process and the next steps. So I hope that's clear, but as we said, we'll have plenty of time when we finished after Ruth wraps up for questions, and we'd be really happy to answer it. But again, I suppose the big thing is that we're really encouraging people to register and get stuck in with us to developing the standard, or If you can't do that, we'll keep an eye on it, and certainly at the public consultation phase, your say, your voice and your input, it will be really, really important and very welcome. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So as I said, there is the link to register. And then once you register, there's a little bit of an application process, not much, but that'll be assessed, and then you'll be contacted by the chair and by NSAI themselves. So it's a fairly straightforward process, to be honest. So I'd encourage you to use that link and to get cracking.
Wrap up. So look, that's me. I suppose it's just, again, I hope that this morning has been useful just to provide you with information about what the work is all about, and obviously, you know, how you could become involved in it, be that on the technical committee itself, and also then maybe at a later stage when we do have a draft that's ready to go to public consultation, coming to a consultation workshop, or you know, providing us with comments if you can't make that workshop yourself. So I think we're going to leave it there.